There's a specific moment in history that the Chinese government makes sure every single student learns about. Not just once, but over and over throughout their entire education. Museums are dedicated to it in almost every major city. Leaders reference it constantly in speeches. It's called the Century of Humiliation. And if you want to understand why China acts the way it does today, why they're so sensitive about Taiwan, why they refuse to back down to Western pressure, why they're building islands in the South China Sea, you need to understand what happened between 1839 and 1949. This isn't ancient history. This is living memory, and it changed everything. Let me ask you something. What would it feel like if your country, the most advanced civilization on Earth, was suddenly carved up by foreign powers like a birthday cake? If drug dealers forced your government to legalize their poison, if foreign armies burned down your greatest monuments, if signs in your own cities said you weren't allowed in certain areas? That's not a hypothetical. That's what happened to China, and they've never forgotten it. In 1839, China was the center of the world. And I'm not exaggerating. The Qing dynasty ruled over the largest, richest, most populated empire on the planet. Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain were luxury goods that European nobility competed to own. The Forbidden City in Beijing made European palaces look basic. China had invented paper, gunpowder, the compass, printing. For thousands of years, they'd been the most advanced civilization on Earth. The Chinese emperor didn't see other nations as equals. He saw them as tributaries who should feel honored just to trade with China. But here's the thing about being on top. You get comfortable. Too comfortable. While Europe was going through the Industrial Revolution, building factories, developing modern weapons, creating new systems of government, China stuck to the old ways. The Qing court genuinely believed they had nothing to learn from outsiders. Foreigners were barbarians. China was the center of civilization. Why would they need to change? This attitude, this confidence, this arrogance, if we're being honest, it cost them everything. The problem started with tea. Britain was obsessed with Chinese tea. I'm talking millions of pounds imported every single year. But China didn't want anything Britain had to offer. They wanted silver hard currency. This created a massive trade imbalance that was draining Britain's treasury. So Britain came up with a solution, a twisted, evil, calculated solution. They started smuggling opium into China. Think about what that means for a second. The most powerful empire in the world at the time, Britain, decided the best way to fix their trade deficit was to get millions of Chinese people addicted to drugs. Opium was grown in British-controlled India, shipped to China, and sold illegally by British merchants working with Chinese smugglers. And it worked terrifyingly well. At first, it was just wealthy Chinese getting hooked. Opium dens became fashionable, places where rich people went to escape reality. But addiction doesn't stay contained to one social class. Within years, opium had spread everywhere. Farmers stopped tending their fields to smoke opium. Soldiers became too weak to fight. Government officials neglected their duties. Silver started flowing out of China and into British pockets. The entire Chinese economy was being destroyed from the inside by a drug epidemic that Britain was deliberately causing. The Qing government knew what was happening. They weren't blind. In 1839, the emperor sent an official named Lin Zexu to Canton to stop the drug trade. Lin was tough. He didn't negotiate. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria that basically said, "Your country has laws against opium. You know it's poison. How would you feel if we were doing this to your people?" He never got a reply. Then Lin did something dramatic. He confiscated over 1,400 tons of opium from British merchants and destroyed it all. He dumped it into the ocean. Britain's response? War. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. And it was brutal in a way that showed just how far China had fallen behind. China had more soldiers. They had home territory advantage. They had the motivation of defending their country. None of it mattered. Britain had steamships that could move up rivers regardless of wind. They had modern cannons with incredible range and accuracy. They had rifles that could reload in seconds. Chinese troops were still using swords, spears, and outdated matchlock guns that took minutes to reload. It wasn't even close. British warships sailed up Chinese rivers, bombarding coastal cities with impunity. Chinese generals used tactics that had worked for centuries, but they were useless against industrial warfare. Imagine bringing a knife to a gunfight. That's what it was like. China lost decisively, humiliatingly. In 1842, they were forced to sign the Treaty of Nantes. This treaty was a disaster that haunts China to this day. China had to pay Britain 21 million ounces of silver. They had to open 5 ports to British trade whether they wanted to or not. They lost control of their own customs and tariffs. Worst of all, they had to hand over Hong Kong to Britain. Forever. But here's where it gets worse, because once Britain showed that China could be beaten, everyone wanted a peace. France demanded similar trading rights. The United States showed up, wanting deals too. Russia started taking territory in the north. And China, once so proud, once so powerful, was forced to say yes to everything. The Qing government was in shock. For the first time in Chinese history, they'd been decisively defeated by foreigners they'd considered barbarians. Then came the Second Opium War in 1856. This time, Britain had help from France. The excuse for the war was laughable. A Chinese patrol boat stopped a ship that might have been flying a British flag. That's all it took. Britain and France decided this was enough reason to invade China again. This war was even more brutal. British and French forces didn't just attack coastal cities. They marched inland toward Beijing itself. In October 1860, they did something that shocked the world. They'd reached the old summer palace, the Yuan, one of the most beautiful architectural complexes on Earth. This wasn't just a palace, it was a vast complex of gardens, temples, galleries, and pavilions built over 150 years. It contained treasures, artworks, and historical artifacts collected over centuries. Ancient books, priceless paintings, jade sculptures, gold and silver objects of incredible craftsmanship. British and French soldiers spent 3 days looting it. They took everything they could carry. Then they set it on fire. The palace burned for 3 days. The smoke could be seen for miles. Victor Hugo, the French writer, called it a crime against civilization committed by 2 bandits. But it happened. China's greatest architectural achievement. Destroyed to teach them a lesson about resisting Western demands. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Tianjin. More ports opened. Foreign diplomats allowed in Beijing. The opium trade legalized. More money paid, Christian missionaries given the right to spread their religion anywhere in China. And here's the kicker. China had to apologize. They had to formally apologize for resisting the British. Let that sink in. China was forced to apologize for trying to stop Britain from poisoning their people. After these defeats, everyone wanted a piece of China. France took control of Vietnam, which had been a Chinese tributary state for centuries. Russia grabbed massive chunks of land in the north, territory larger than many European countries. Germany claimed parts of Shandong province. Japan, which had recently modernized itself, looked at China and saw weakness. China wasn't colonized the way Africa or India was. Instead, it was carved into spheres of influence. Foreign powers controlled China's ports, railways, and mines. They ran their own courts in Chinese cities and didn't have to follow Chinese law. Chinese people, in their own country, became second-class citizens. Insomniaria signs literally said, "No dogs or Chinese allowed." Think about that. In their own country. The Qing government tried to respond. They've launched the self-strengthening movement in the 1860s, trying to adopt Western technology while keeping Chinese values. They built shipyards. They bought modern weapons. They sent students abroad to learn, but it was too little, too late. The corruption ran too deep. The court was divided between reformers who wanted radical change and conservatives who wanted to preserve tradition. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who held real power, cared more about maintaining her position than saving the country. By 1900, the Chinese people had had enough. A group called the Boxers rose up. They were officially called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. They practiced martial arts and believed they had magical powers that made them immune to bullets. They attacked foreigners, Chinese Christians, and anyone associated with Western influence. They besieged the foreign legation quarter in Beijing. The Qing government, desperate and confused, made a catastrophic decision. They decided to support the Boxers. They thought maybe, just maybe, popular rage could succeed where the government had failed. That was a massive mistake. 8 foreign nations formed an alliance: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and also they invaded China together. They crushed The Boxers. They occupied Beijing again, and they forced China to pay 450 million taels of silver in reparations. That's more money than the entire Chinese government's annual revenue. The payments were scheduled to take 39 years. China would be paying for trying to resist foreign domination until 1940. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological breaking point. The Chinese people realized their government couldn't protect them. The legitimacy of the Qing dynasty was destroyed. If the government couldn't defend China from foreigners, what was it good for? In 1911, the Qing dynasty finally collapsed. Revolutions broke out across China. The last emperor, a 6-year-old boy named Pui, abdicated. China became a republic. But it wasn't the happy ending anyone hoped for. The country immediately fell apart. Warlords carved up different regions and fought each other for control. The central government barely existed. Peasants starved while generals lived like kings. China, once the most advanced civilization on Earth, had become a failed state. And then things got even worse. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. The Chinese government protested to the League of Nations. The League did nothing. Japan got away with it. Emboldened, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. What followed was 8 years of devastating conflict. The events in Nanking in December 1937 represent one of the darkest moments of the 20th century. Historians estimate between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers lost their lives in just 6 weeks. Foreign observers in the city were so disturbed that they created an international safety zone to protect as many people as possible. For over a century, China was a nation brought to its knees. But how did a country once called the sick man of Asia become the superpower it is today? The answer lies in a period of history so painful, it still shapes every decision China makes. This is the story of the Century of Humiliation. Let's start in the midst of World War II. For 8 long years, China was locked in a brutal fight against Japan. The two rival Chinese factions, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists, put their civil war on hold to face the common enemy. The cost was immense. As many as 20 million Chinese people died. Cities were leveled, villages burned. The suffering was almost unimaginable. But through this shared tragedy, something unexpected began to form. A people fractured for so long started to find a common purpose. This shared experience of resistance began to forge a new, unified Chinese identity. The will to survive and the hope for a new beginning simmered beneath the surface. Then, in 1945, World War II ended. Japan was defeated, but China's fight was far from over. The civil war between the nationalists and communists erupted once again. By 1949, Mao Zedong and the communists claimed victory. Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan. On October 1st, 1949, Mao stood in Tiananmen Square and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. His words were simple, yet they echoed with the weight of history. The Chinese people have stood up. Imagine what that meant to generations who had known nothing but humiliation, who saw their country carved up and controlled by foreign powers. For the first time in 110 years, China was united under a strong, central government. The nation was poor, exhausted, and in ruins. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that China, once again, belonged to the Chinese. The Communist Party made sure no one would ever forget the suffering that came before. The Century of Humiliation became a cornerstone of the new national identity. It's taught in every school, with students learning the details of every unequal treaty, every invasion. Museums in nearly every major city are dedicated to this period. In Nanjing, a memorial honors the millions who lost their lives. In Beijing, the ruins of the old summer palace are preserved just as the British and French left them a permanent, physical scar. The message is crystal clear. This must never, ever happen again. And this isn't just about remembering the past. It's a powerful political tool. The Communist Party uses the memory of humiliation to legitimize its rule. They are the saviors who made China strong, who restored its dignity. Therefore, any criticism of the party is portrayed as a weakness that could lead back to those dark days. Any challenge to their power is painted as an invitation for foreign domination to return. This narrative is the driving force behind almost everything China does today. The massive military buildup, that's to ensure no foreign power can ever invade again. The relentless push for economic development, to guarantee China is never again poor and weak. The aggressive positions on Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. It is all about reclaiming what they see as lost territory and ensuring China can never be pushed around. Under Mao, China experimented with radical policies. The Great Leap Forward, meant to rapidly industrialize the country, instead led to a devastating famine that killed tens of millions. The Cultural Revolution, designed to purge society of old ideas, destroyed priceless cultural heritage and ruined countless lives. But through all the chaos and tragedy, one thing was constant. China was independent. For better or worse, they were making their own decisions. After Mao's death in 1976, Deng Xiaoping took the helm and changed everything. He opened China to the world, welcoming foreign investment and market economics, all while maintaining the Communist Party's tight grip on power. He called it socialism with Chinese characteristics. What it really meant was, let's get rich. And it worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Over the next 4 decades, China experienced the most explosive economic growth in human history. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. Cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen morphed from sleepy backwaters into gleaming, futuristic metropolises. China became the world's factory. By 2010, it was the second largest economy on the planet. Today, it rivals the United States in economic might and leads the world in manufacturing and trade. Modern China is obsessed with proving it back on toppy. They hosted the most expensive Olympics in history. They build the world's tallest skyscrapers. They send rovers to Mars. They're funding massive infrastructure projects across the globe with the Belt and Road Initiative. And when Chinese leaders give speeches, they constantly reference the Century of Humiliation and Xi Jinping as Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. The message is always the same. China was great. China was humiliated. And now, China is great again. This isn't just government propaganda. Ordinary Chinese people feel this pride deeply. There's a genuine belief that China is finally reclaiming its rightful place in the world. So when Western countries criticize China over human rights or trade, many Chinese citizens don't see it as a legitimate concern. They see it as yet another attempt to keep China down, a modern echo of the Opium Wars. If you want to understand why China behaves the way it does on the world stage, you have to understand the Century of Humiliation. It's not an excuse, but it is an explanation. When China refuses to back down on Taiwan, it is because losing the island would feel like another piece of their country being carved away by foreign hands. When they build military bases in the South China Sea, it is to control their own waters so foreign navies couldn't and sail in and dictate terms like the British did. When they push back hard against Western criticism, it's because they hear the same arrogance that led to the Opium Wars. The fear of being weak and vulnerable again is the engine of Chinese policy. The Communist Party's legitimacy rests on one single promise. They will never let China be humiliated again. If they appear weak, their entire reason for being in power starts to crumble. This history casts a long shadow over China's relationships with other countries. To this day, Japan and China argue over how history textbooks describe the war. Every time a Japanese politician visits the controversial Yasukuni Shrine, it sparks outrage in China. With Britain, there's a massive gap in historical memory. Chinese children learn about the Opium Wars in exhaustive detail. Most British people barely know they even happened. So when Britain criticizes China now, many in China think you got millions of our people hooked on drugs for profit and you want to lecture us about morality. Let's be clear. China was genuinely wronged. The Opium Wars were a state-sponsored drug trafficking operation. The burning of the Summer Palace was an act of immense cultural vandalism. Japan's invasion was devastating. The carving up of China was fundamentally unjust. But the China of today is not the victim it was in 1840. It has a global power with nuclear weapons, the world's largest army, and an economy that moves markets. The real question is, can a country move forward when it's constantly looking back? Can a national identity built on the memory of humiliation ever truly feel secure? Or will the deep wounds of the past demand more than just economic success? Some argue China just wants respect and security, and once it feels safe, it will become a responsible global citizen. Others worry that a nation so deeply shaped by trauma will struggle to ever move past it. What is certain is this. You could not understand modern China without understanding what happened between 1839 and 1949. The dragon was wounded. The dragon recovered. And the dragon remembers everything. If this story fascinated you, there's more to explore. Click on the video on your screen right now. Thanks for watching.